So I want to talk about one of the reasons that we haven't made more progress in the direction that we've been talking about. How do we create a well-being economy? How do we create a system that actually works for everyone? We know that there are planetary boundaries. We know that we're exceeding or coming close to exceeding these planetary boundaries in a number of areas: climate change, biodiversity, the nitrogen and phosphorus cycle. We've known about these things for quite a while. The question really is, why haven't we made progress more quickly? And my point today will be that I think one of the main reasons is that we are literally addicted to the current system. What does that mean? Just like an individual is addicted to substances, we get very positive short-term feedbacks from the way the system is set up now. The problem is we can see long-term problems. So how do we learn from what has worked to overcome individual addictions that might be applied to these societal addictions, if you want to think of them that way? So one of the underlying addictions that we have is the addiction to this idea that we can grow the economy, we can grow GDP indefinitely. And that's a reassuring lie, but there are inconvenient truths surrounding that, and some of that reassuring lie is leading us in exactly the wrong direction these days. We also know that GDP was never designed as a measure of societal well-being. Simon Kuznets, one of the original architects of GDP, cautioned against explicitly that. Do not, he cautioned, use GDP as a welfare measure. If you want to talk about growth, you have to say, growth of what and for what purpose. And I think if you press an economist, if you press them against the wall, and they will admit, yes, GDP doesn't measure societal well-being, and yet it is used as the primary measure, of societal success these days. It still is. But I think we're making progress in overcoming that. Robert Kennedy, back in 1978, famously said, that GDP measures everything except that which makes life worthwhile. So how do we overcome this addiction, and how do we leave GDP behind? And all of the things that implies. So there's, the underlying economic paradigm, the fact that it's increasing inequality, it's actually reducing well-being, or at least stagnating well-being in places around the world. It's not really achieving the goals that we want it to achieve, and we know that it's heading us over the edge of a cliff. It's not sustainable, and it's not desirable. So what do we do? Well, as I said, I think we can learn some things from what works at the individual scale to overcome addictions. And one therapy that seems to work quite well is something called motivational interviewing. Now, this therapy is based on not confronting the addict with the problem. I mean, that seems to be what we're doing at the societal scale. We're saying, yes, we're heading over the edge of a cliff. We're doing all the wrong things. We've got to stop using so much energy and resources. That's at the individual scale, that would be very counterproductive. That gets an immediate denial, defensive kind of reaction. No, this is not a problem. I'm doing perfectly fine. You see the parallels here. This is exactly the kind of reaction we're getting from society when you frame the problem in that way. Not that it's not true in both cases. We are heading over the edge of a cliff in both individual and the societal scale. But if you want to actually change behavior, you have to frame these arguments slightly differently. So what motivational interviewing does is start first with engaging the addict in discussing their life goals. What do they want to achieve with their life? Take them out of the present situation into the future, and say, what kind of life do you want for yourself? Once you've established that, then you can begin to talk about, what you're doing now really helping you achieve those goals, and if not, you might want to change your behavior. Here are some ideas for how to change that behavior. I think you may already suspect what the analogy at the societal scale is going to be. And people have talked about it already. At the societal scale, we want to first start with a process of engaging society in building a shared vision. What does society want to achieve? What are our societal goals? The challenge really is how to do that. There are these therapies at the individual scale. What is the societal therapy look like? How do we actually engage society in building that shared vision? Well, there has been some significant progress along those lines. As we've already heard, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, I think, is a giant step, really, in the right direction of building a shared vision at the societal scale. Shared vision among policymakers, among academics, among a subset of society. I think the challenge now is how do you engage society in general in this shared vision, and articulating it and fleshing it out, and showing that we can build a better world, that there are really alternatives out there, that we don't have to go along, with business as usual, the way it's normally conceived. I think that's going to be a huge challenge, but I think there are some things that we can begin to think about, and I think the first one is just recognizing that we are in an addiction, and so don't expect things to happen overnight just simply by saying this is what we ought to do. It may be perfectly true, but we've got to expect this kind of resistance. We've got to expect that it will take some significant therapy. And like I said, a big part of that is going to be how do you engage the general public in the kind of world that we're really trying to create. The Great Transition Initiative and several other groups have been doing this for quite a while and looking at a scenario planning kind of approach. You create several scenarios for the future and say, here are our choices, as a society. Here's the kind of range of possible things that could result depending on the choices that we make now. This process of scenario planning has been used effectively in a whole range of organizations. It was actually originally designed by Shell Oil back in the 70s, but it's been used at the societal scale, at the community scale. And I think it's a very effective way of engaging the people who are part of the process, at least, in thinking about which of these scenarios is preferable. I think if I took a survey of the crowd here, I can guess which of these 4 scenarios people would prefer. And I probably don't need to do that in order to get the result, but we did do that in Australia. What we did was conduct a public opinion survey. We got about 2,000 individuals to read about these 4 scenarios that were very similar to these with slightly different names and contextualized for Australia. Had them read about them and then take an online survey and say, which ones do you prefer? What's your favorite of these 4? And also we asked them which one they thought the country was headed toward. And the vast majority preferred the Great Transition, I would call that the SDG scenario. We called it community well-being in that survey. But they also thought that the market forces, business as usual scenario was the direction that the country was headed in. And I think you'll probably find that in many countries where if you ask people to sit down and say, in the year 2050, in some place, some time far enough in the future, think about what you want the country or the world to look like, they're going to say they want a world where there is no hunger, it's more equitable, that where the natural capital and natural ecosystems are protected, and all of the things embedded in the SDGs, I think, come very high on the list. And it's a much smaller fraction of people that are really embedded in the current system. But people don't know that they have a choice. So I think that's our real challenge, is how do you get that out there? And I think we can take it much further than simply a static picture. Imagine that we had a TV series that was running where the same characters were living in these 4 different futures, and people could envision themselves and their children living in a different world, and how their interactions both interpersonally and with the community and with the rest of the world would happen. That's, I think, part of what we need to get there. What's the 12-step program? How do we make the changes? What sort of things do we need to change? This came partly from Peter Victor's work. He was looking at the Canadian economy and what would need to change actually to create a stable and sustainable system. So we need new measures, new meanings and measures of success. We need to get beyond GDP to the GPI or something even beyond that. How do we measure well-being if we hope to achieve it? We need limits on materials, energy, waste, and land use. We need to stay within planetary boundaries. We need more meaningful prices. The market lies to us about the price of everything. We need to look at what are the true costs of everything that we consume if we really want to become more sustainable. We need more durable and repairable products. We're not producing these things simply to maximize activity. We want products that work for us, that provide the right services in the most efficient way. Fewer status goods and more community goods. The purpose of the economy should not be a status competition. It should be one that helps actually improve well-being, more broadly conceived. More informative advertising will help us do that. Advertisers should not be telling us that we're not happy and we can only be happy if we buy their products. They should tell us what the products do and why they're good. Better screening of technology. Technology is a good servant, but a poor master. So we should decide what we want technology to do and not just go wherever the technology leads. More efficient capital stock. This is kind of the equivalent of the better, more efficient products. We want capital that lasts. More local, less global. And this is not just to reduce energy consumption and transport, but to recognize that local economies actually support well-being. That if we're really trying to focus on improving well-being, that's an important thing. Reduced inequality. There are many reasons for this. We know that more unequal societies have much higher social problems of all different kinds. If we really want to improve well-being, we need to reduce inequality. We know how to do that. We've been doing that. We did that after World War II and significantly reduced inequality until about 1980. Less work, more leisure. Most people do not object to this one as a policy. But I think it's really important. How do you get the work-life balance correct? How do you share the work, basically? How do you get fulfilling work, that actually does contribute to well-being and not just making money to buy stuff that we don't really need? And finally, education for life and not just work. How do we inform people about what well-being really is, how to improve their individual well-being, their community well-being, and their global well-being? Education is not just to get a job to make money. It's really to help people improve their and society's well-being. And thank you very much.